you so much. So we'll get started. From the end all the way in, I'll have everybody introduce themselves, tell us what your background is, pretty much why you're qualified to be up here, just kidding, and kind of what you're doing right now, and we'll get started. So, James.
My name is James. I'm actually on staff here at Blue Oaks with Groups and Next Steps, but I'm also on staff with our Bayside Counseling. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist, and actually was a student of Stephanie Kane, so there we go. Whoa, is that me?
That was probably me.
Oh, okay. But yeah, so that's my story.
That makes you qualified, right?
That makes me qualified, yeah.
Is my mic on? Okay. My name is Wesley Town. I'm the lead pastor of Bayside Davis. If any of you have ever been to Davis, also the founder of Better Days, which is an organization where we write, podcast, teach, do conferences on mental health and suffering within the Christian context.
Real quick on Wes. Wes is a major reason why we're doing this Sound Mind series right now. He's been sounding the alarm for us for a long time to do a series on mental health, so thanks for getting in the trenches and making this happen, man. We appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lynn Bradshaw. I'm a recent graduate of William Jessup University, and I spent 20 years teaching young children, partnering with parents, working with adolescents, and I'm a brain spotting trauma therapist. I work at Pacific Counseling and Trauma Center, and I also do life coaching and parent support.
Yeah. One quick thing about Lynn. Lynn is a phenomenal therapist. If you have a kid and they're struggling with some trauma, definitely the person who you want to see. I mean, she's very efficient in what she does. We've seen firsthand her work, so thanks so much, Lynn.
I'm Stephanie Kane, and I am a therapist. I'm licensed here in the state of California as well as in the state of Georgia. I am a professor at William Jessup University. I'm the director of the Masters of Counseling program there, remote program, and the undergraduate psychology program there. And I have been working with families, children, and adults for the last 20 years, I guess, starting 2003, yeah.
Wow, 20 years.
I have a PhD in counseling.
Yes. So if you don't know, Stephanie is my wife, more than qualified to have this conversation. Taught me everything I know and audits any message that I have. Like today, I got a message telling me that I could not tell people that if you don't pray, your brain is obese. So.
Wait, you said that today?
I did say that.
Only in one service.
No, I said it in 2 services. I didn't say it in the last service. It's biblical. Anyway. My name is Jason Kane. Obviously, I'm pastor here at Bayside Blue Oaks. I actually have a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. In Georgia, was on the process of getting licensed. Had 1 more year to go. It's a 3-year process, and then I moved out here and have not started that process again in California because it takes way too long, and I don't have the time to do it. But maybe one day, I don't know. So glad to be able to just engage in this conversation today. Wes, I'll give you the first question. The church has not always done well with mental health. Where do you think we are in this present moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say 10 years ago, in Christianity, nobody was talking about mental health. And yet so many people were silently struggling, but didn't feel like they could be vulnerable in the context of the church. Over the last 10 years, I have seen the narrative change so much within Christianity. And a lot of that had to do with a number of pastors that died by suicide within like the last 6 years. That opened up the floodgates of conversations in Christianity. And what's amazing to me is, first of all, good for Bayside for doing this series. Like, this is an amazing thing for a church this large and this influential to talk about this. And the reverberation is going to be amazing, in other churches that follow Bayside. But what I find is this conversation is so open right now in churches. Churches are teaching on it. I travel quite a bit and do talks at churches. Teams, like staffs of churches, want to be trained and developed and cultivated around this because they're recognizing that more than half their people are struggling with their mental health on any given Sunday. And this is a really, really important conversation, not only to have in the church, but to have correctly in the church, to have a healthy narrative around mental health and following Jesus. So I think right now people are really open to this, and especially bridging the gap between the mental health psychology conversation and the theology Jesus Bible conversation. This is the work that I'm trying to do with writing and teaching, is to bridge that gap, because I think that there is not a gap, that mental health is rooted in God's design for human flourishing, and theology, the story of Scripture. So we're at a really good spot.
Yeah. Lynn, you work with adolescents and families, and of course, there's so many kids now that are needing mental health services and trying to get help. What are some of the trends you're seeing and things that families can do to help?
So, one of the biggest trends I'm seeing, especially with teenagers, is the need to start looking at alternate ways to get education. If I'm being really honest, that's a big challenge for a lot of people. A lot of teenagers are really inundated with social media, but teenagers have always felt like they were really under a lens where everyone was watching, and now it literally feels like that to them all of the time. So, oftentimes with parents, I'm just really needing to connect with them so that we can find, obviously we need sometimes a middle ground so that our teenagers can feel like they're being heard and seen, and also be able to get their education and still connect with friends. So that's a big one. Definitely a lot of anxiety and depression, no surprise there. But also to the point made earlier, you know, mental health is something that's talked about so much more now. And so there are really wonderful benefits to that, but there are also a lot of children that are self-diagnosing. And I'm personally of the opinion that some people may prefer to have a diagnosis so that they know the path that they want to walk, or they feel validated by that. But many people are just needing to work through some trauma, and I think needing more connection with their parents. And that's a big part of what I see my role as, is helping parents to just create a healthy connection with their child.
What would you say are just some of the pitfalls of self-diagnosing? I think that's something that happens in kids, but also in adults as well. Why is that problematic?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that the pitfalls are that just kind of like you're going to see the things that you want to see if you're overly committed to, I'm anxious. Well, sure, most of us get anxious over certain things, but it doesn't mean that we're always anxious all of the time.
Right.
And so I think that it can become a way that children kind of pigeonhole themselves and maybe stop seeing that there are other indicators that things are going right, for example, versus everything going wrong.
Yeah. Speaking of diagnosing, we have this question later, but I think I'll ask it now to the panel. If someone thinks that they might have some sort of mental health issue, what is the best way for them to figure out if they actually have something that's diagnosed? I think someone asked a question, or it was submitted, how do I diagnose myself? We definitely know that's not the way to do it. So how does a person go about seeking help?
Well, I think the safest route is to seek a professional. If you suspect that you are struggling in integral areas of your life, work, love, play, in your relationships, if those are struggling and you think it's because there could be a mental health issue happening, seek therapy. What happens typically in the first session of a therapy is called intake, and that's when the therapist gets all of this information. They conduct kind of like an assessment. They may take one session or two sessions, but during that assessment process, the purpose is to identify if there is anything there that you and the therapist should be aware of. Perhaps a diagnosis, or maybe not a diagnosis. Perhaps there are just some habits that are unhealthy that you are in a pattern of using. And so you will know very quickly when you seek professional assistance on what's going on and where you are with that. If you Google, it can take you down an abyss. And there's so much information online that sounds good that is so wrong. And if you don't have the background to know that, you can end up going down the wrong path. And so I wouldn't advise somebody to just Google it. It's so much more nuanced than what you see. I know there's a lot of really great articles that give you kind of like a general knowledge where they say these symptoms, but it's even more nuanced than that when you go into actual diagnosis. There could be more involved. Some symptoms are in multiple diagnoses, and you may think you have like 7 things, but you may have none of those things. So I would say the safest route is to go ahead and make the investment in therapy and get a professional to do an assessment.
It's just like if you're feeling sick and you Google what your symptoms are, you find out you died 3 weeks ago. Right?
Yeah.
Very
So
and,
true.
And you can go, I mean, and if it's like if it's in the moment you're in an emergency, you can even go through the ER. You can go through an emergency room and they can give you an assessment there.
Wes.
I just want to add one thing. Beyond just the condition that you're struggling with, the reason why it's so important to go to a professional is to get to the root. Like, what is causing this? I think so many people in our culture are saying, oh, I have an anxiety condition, or I'm struggling with depression, or what have you. And sometimes we so focused on all the symptoms and all the experiences that we're feeling mentally, emotionally, physiologically, that we miss out on the important work of getting to the root causes to bring healing. And so I think that's such an important part of the equation that is missed out sometimes if you're just on TikTok, OCD of TikTok or anxiety on TikTok. People are literally diagnosing on TikTok. That's like the number one social media platform for understanding mental health conditions. So I would prefer somebody to go to Dr. Stephanie Kane, because I think long-term, the benefits of not just knowing what you have, but understanding the roots and dynamics behind it. And our lives are complex. Like we live in an ecosystem of complexity of our stories and our feelings and our emotions and all the things happening inside of us. You just need somebody that's gifted by God to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Just by show of hands, how many of you have kids teenage age or younger? Teenage, just by show of hands in the room. Wow, a good number of you. So James works with teenagers and families, and one of the questions we think is important to answer is, if you're a family and you feel disconnected from your kid, everybody, my kids are 12, thankfully we still feel connected, but people warn me, like, they're gonna hit those teenage years and they're never gonna talk to you again.
I rebuke that.
Yeah, exactly. I do too. But if you are at that place where you feel disconnected as a family with your teenager, with your younger kid, what are some things that you can do?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like three things that I kind of look for, especially working with families. The first one is like how well do you know them? Kind of anonymous. Do they feel anonymous? Because I think one of the things that we grow up saying a lot is my parents just don't understand me, or they just don't get it, right? And I think when you're able to spending time, it's kind of that tell time that's just like, just spend time with them, but get to know them. Do they feel seen by you? Do they feel known by you? Do you know them and kind of know their patterns? Because I even actually think, we were talking about this a little bit backstage, but even how do you know if they're ready for therapy, if they're ready to go? Do you know their patterns, their habits? Are they going outside of what their normal kind of habits or kind of behaviors? And so do you know them? The second one is, I think too, is kids need to feel appreciated. I think sometimes just, for the small things that they do. And I think if we would see this also, like, let's say we go to work, and I just felt like, man, no one just appreciates me, man. I'm doing all this work, I'm doing these things, but they don't see it. I get pretty frustrated. I'd probably start disconnecting and disengaging at some level with the people around me. But I think that's also sometimes where we see some disconnect is they just don't feel like what they're doing, or maybe the chores that they're doing are just going unnoticed. And I think we could see that in relationships. But the third one I also see is kind of ambiguity. And what I mean by that is, are the expectations of them clear? Even if when they fall back, right? So they're gonna earn your distrust at some point, right? They're gonna stay out late. They're gonna do whatever. But I think also, hey, how can they earn that trust back? Because I think that makes you feel safe too. Because you're going, okay, it's not just like, hey, here are the 5 steps for you to earn my trust back, but kind of help them kind of quantify it a little bit. How can they come back a little bit? How can you earn that trust? Maybe it's spending more time. Maybe it's certain things they do for X amount of months. And I feel like I've seen those kind of help kind of bring the kid back in. I think especially with chores, when there's conversations about responsibilities and chores, and they feel known, they feel appreciated. I mean, man, I just seen it go up. But I think spending time, physical touch too. Hey kiddo, how you doing? In a positive regard, I think is absolutely huge. But just spending time so that they can talk through some of this stuff, especially as they get older and into the teen years, they're gonna look for more freedoms, but they have to earn your trust. That's something I'll tell kids all the time is, look, you want more freedoms, you gotta earn your parents' trust. It's kind of in a balance that way.
Very good. Anybody have anything else to add to that about?
I'm glad that somebody brought that up, because attachment is so critical, particularly at this age, because it will carry on through adulthood. So if there is a sense of detachment, if you're asking that question, it's because you sense that there's this disconnection between you and your child, then what's happening is there could be a break in attachment. And that means that the kid could be, a fundamental or existential question is, can I trust, if I can't trust my parent, can I trust anyone? If I don't feel seen by my parent, then who is the person supposed to see me the most? Then would other people see me? And then that will affect their interpersonal relationships at work or romantically, in other areas. And so there's so much power in having that healthy attachment between you and your child. So I'm really happy that somebody asked that. Really be intentional about repairing, which is what James was giving, like these steps on how to repair these relationships when you notice a detachment has occurred. Your consistency and your relentlessness and you persevering in pursuing a relationship with your child, regardless of their behavior, is going to plant the seed of building trust in other areas of their lives, going throughout their lives.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing that I
Yep.
just remember? I would say too, as you're getting to know, you don't have to accept everything, kind of force them into, okay, I want you to make sure you have these values, or kind of go, okay, if they have a certain value, I don't think you necessarily have to always accept it, if that kind of makes sense, or agree with it, but at least come to understand and come to an understanding of where they're coming from and have conversation around that. If that kind of makes sense? Because I think sometimes we'll sit down and they may, let's say even they have a biblical disagreement with you. I think when you're able to know and have that conversation and understand maybe where they're coming from, they can see yours instead of it's this agenda of I'm going to make sure that you have my specific values and fight that. But I think when you are able to build into that relationship, they're gonna take on the same values that you want them to.
Yeah. Is there a book or a resource either the three of you would recommend? Just
Funny that you just said that, because with this subject, my favorite analogy around parenting is a pool analogy from a book called Untangled. And it's a book about raising adolescent girls in specific. And the idea is that when your children are little, you're in the pool with them. They have floaties on. You have to be right there to create safety. You're playing with them. As they get older, they start to play with their friends in the pool. Maybe you're on the side of the pool. As they become teenagers, you might not need to be right there at the side of the pool, because you might be creating some codependency. And then teenagers will come to adults when they have issues they need to talk about, we hope. And the idea being, as a parent, doing a check-in, what's going to keep my child coming to the side of the pool? And and I always explain this to parents, none of us is perfect. We're going to screw things up. We're modeling the correction, right? As Stephanie said, we really want to focus on, we don't want our children to be aiming to be perfect people either. That can create anxiety. So just keeping in mind and asking your child, they have a rule book for themselves. We all do. And so really learning your child's rule book in the same way, if you're in couples therapy, you might be learning each other's rule book. I got that one from Stephanie. But children have a rule book, and they're all different. So keeping your children close is about watching them create their own rule book and reading from it. So
The name of that book is Untangled by Lisa D'Amour.
Yeah, she also has a great podcast, The Psychology of Parenting.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Psychology of Parenting by Lisa D'Amour. Check that book out if you're looking to connect with your kids a little bit more. It's definitely a difficult thing to do. So the Bible says to honor your parents. I'm getting to questions that people are asking now. The Bible says to honor your parents. What do you do and how do you honor your parents if they neglected you and they're breaching your boundaries now?
Yeah, this goes back to the attachment point of now you're an adult and you recognize that you have the relationship with our parents change as we grow older, right? Because we don't need them in the pool with us. We don't even need them at the side of the pool. And so now it's up to us to decide if we want to keep that relationship going. Well, what happens when there are either abusive or unhealthy patterns in the dynamic between you and your parents? And really, you cannot make them change. I mean, they can choose to, be intentional about that, but that's not always an easy thing to do. So then this is where you set healthy boundaries, healthy emotional boundaries for yourself. Are there specific dynamics that occur in specific settings that you find really take you to an unhealthy place? Maybe trigger areas where you're trying to do work and you heal from. It's important to set those boundaries. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes there are some areas where you have to create some distance in order to protect yourself and also preserve the relationship that you have with your parents. Because if you continue to expose yourself to a pattern that you know is really unhealthy for you and that will continue to push you away, you'll find yourself burned out and probably want nothing to do with your parents. And so it's important to create those healthy distances. all these dynamics are different. Maybe you have parents where you can communicate that and say, hey, this makes me uncomfortable, this particular behavior, and be specific. Sometimes we talk about a personhood. We're like, you are selfish. And when you tell somebody that, how do I become unselfish to you, especially if I didn't see myself as a selfish person? Be specific about the behavior. Hey, when this happens, when we're at the dinner table and all that's served is meat and I am vegetarian and I've been a vegetarian for 20 years, that act feels like a selfish act. I feel ignored in that act. That's more behavioral, and that's something that somebody can receive and realize, oh, if I adjust that behavior, then maybe that'll get me back in a better place with that person. So really check your language when you're communicating to your parents if there's something going on. And I recognize that there can be some people in the room that says, no matter any angle I take it, it just falls flat. And if it comes to that point, that's when you really just institute those healthy boundaries and be very thoughtful and strategic about when you want to be and how long you want to be around your parents, and when a conversation should end, when it starts going down a path, maybe shaming language or something like that, where you're like, you know what, Mom, Dad, I'm going to have to end this conversation now. I'll talk to you another time.
That's good. What is the difference between offering someone support and enabling them in what they're dealing with? Hey, if you ever go to a panel and you don't hear silence, don't trust them because they're answering too quick without thinking. So this is good. I'm just saying that to make y'all look good since y'all are stumped right now.
No, it's not stumped. I think everybody has so much they could say, honestly.
I mean, I'll start. I just think as followers of Jesus, we should always lean into the support side. Like, that is the way of Jesus. Like, he connected with people from various, places and spaces and contexts of life that were hurting, struggling, what have you. And I just think if we're going to lean on one end, we just say we want to support. Now, sometimes that support relationship can become toxic, unhealthy. That's where we have to evaluate, okay, like maybe I need to change my approach in this relationship or my boundaries or what have you. But I just think, man, if we're going to lean one way, let's lean to just help people and love people and connect with people in their pain and what they're processing through.
Yeah, and in what ways has God specifically equipped you in support? Like what is unique to you that you do really well in providing support, in conveying love, in conveying your care? You don't have to be everything to that person, but if there's one or a couple things that you say, I do this really well, then commit to the way that God has called you to be present and supportive to people in that way, and be obedient and disciplined in that, regardless of that person's behavior.
I want to jump on about anxiety and enabling, because this is a place where a lot of people get stuck. Since COVID, we've seen rates of anxiety skyrocket, not just for children, but for adults. And one example might be social anxiety. So people that are really struggling to connect with others, especially maybe a larger setting, think of a party, something like that. So whether it's a friend, adult, child, really creating an environment of showing the person with anxiety that they can do it, that it might turn out really well, and not over empathizing, because a lot of the time as parents, when children are younger, we have safety concerns, and so we're having to protect more. But as children get older, or even adults, really setting the example that you can push through and try it and see what happens is a really important piece of anxiety treatment. So,
very good.
Well, a great example of that is, I don't know if I share about you, but me. Jason and I have both struggled with anxiety, and we both publicly speak all the time. And we still do it, although it's a constant reality in our life. And it's not like the act of, maybe part of it is the act of speaking, but there's so many dynamics in that relationship with, leading and teaching and what have you. But I just think embracing the fact that just because I'm feeling anxious doesn't mean I don't get on a plane and speak somewhere. It doesn't mean I don't get in front of my church and teach that Sunday. So I think what you said is so valuable, and it even translates into adulthood as well. Sometimes God is calling us to do something that is not familiar, or we have these things that are taking place in the inner dialogue of our mind that, maybe is not reality, and we need to enter into that. And then sometimes you just have things that you're in your humanity, you're uncomfortable with. Like, not everything that we get to do is comfortable. And so, there's a beautiful thing in our weakness in the midst of that as well. So
I think a good distinguishing with support versus enabling is, what am I doing to feed this person emotionally, to be present with a person, versus feeding the behavior? Am I feeding the person, or am I feeding their behavior? Enabling is doing things that support a particular behavior that helps them continue that, versus am I doing things that are conveying love to the person, that are conveying care to that person?
That's good. How do we communicate our own mental health struggles to others in a way that's productive and healthy?
Oh, James and Lynn had, was it?
It was Wesley.
Wes and Lynn.
had
Wes and Lynn had a
phenomenal
great
answer.
response. Yeah.
Well, so sometimes we're intimidated because we're afraid of being vulnerable. And I think vulnerability is at the deeper level of all healthy relationships. So if we're uncomfortable being vulnerable, we have to start incrementally taking baby steps of being vulnerable in those relationships and sharing our own struggles and pain and weakness, especially to the people that we're closest to. And I think secondly, sometimes we self-sabotage ourselves internally. We think they're not going to understand. But if you don't give them an A, B, or C, they're never going to get to Z. So we have to help them to start to understand by conveying to them, hey, like, I'm really struggling with depression, and here's the things that are a part of that narrative in my life right now. I think when we do that, most people really connect with that, and they want to help, and they want to engage with us in a healthy way based on what we've been vulnerable in sharing and teaching them. This is a part of my life with human suffering and such, where if I tell somebody, hey, this is a part of, our context and the suffering that we go through, this is what's helpful, this is what's hard. So if you could do these things, this would be really, really beneficial relationally. People tend to just say, oh, I'm so glad that you told me that. This is really helpful for me in engaging with you. So I just think the more we're able to do those types of things, the better understanding, those gaps, bridging understanding in our relationships will be, and the better people will interact with whatever we're suffering with.
I would also add to that the idea of connecting with people. I'm often telling my clients that whatever you're struggling with, your brain is likely telling you that you're alone in this, that you're the only person experiencing that, and that's just not true. And so one of the things that I actually feel inclined to do often as a therapist is check in with my client and say, would it be helpful for you to know if I've had a similar struggle? Or would you like me to share an experience, within reason, obviously, but oftentimes people are coming to therapy because they're missing connection with other people, and the one place they're really not connecting with other people is over their anxiety, depression, you name it, bipolar disorder, whatever it is, trauma. So I really think that the therapeutic relationship is a great place to get correction that maybe you haven't had that experience in other relationships in your life.
It's great. James?
Well, I was going to say, I think you guys said this backstage, and I wanted to bring it, but it was about repair. Like when something happens, let's say, that relationship is maybe disconnected or something occurred. And I think when you're talking with them, it's in the repair. I think you can try to kind of convey, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what happened. This is why, I'm so sorry. And kind of being able to repair that relationship, which I think was huge. I don't know if I said that all, but I just wanted to bring it up because I thought what you said back there was really good.
James, this is a very practical question. You work at the Counseling Center for the church.
Yes.
Someone asking, is there a cost associated with going to the Counseling Center? I know there's different tiers and all that. Can you explain that process?
Yes. So there is one process. You can go to our website, or you can text counseling to 56316. We have kind of 3 different types of therapists. So we have a trainee, which is someone who's in grad school and acquiring their hours. So each therapist in California is going for their licensure, LMFT or LPCC, has to gain about I don't know, is it LPCC
3,000.
3,000? Yeah, so it's about 3,000 hours. So they're in grad school accruing those hours. And so they're about $80 to about $35. So they have a sliding scale. For associates, they're out of grad school and accruing towards, just accruing hours towards their 3,000. I'm about 700 away from being done, which is going to be phenomenal, almost there. But that's about 100 to about 75. And then for the license, it's between 125 and 160. They've gone through all the hours and all the tests and everything like that. So those are kind of the 3 different types of tiers that we have at our counseling center.
Yeah,
right
so
now.
depending on, I guess, the level of counselor that you want, depends on how much it costs. But don't just think because a counselor costs more or less that talks about how competent they are. It's not the case.
Right.
You want to find a counselor that works for you. Also, I was speaking to someone that attends our church, and they own an organization called, what is it called?
Sierra Wellness?
Sierra Health and Wellness or something or another. And he's offered to put up some resources to help anybody who needs help. So if you are looking for a therapist and you need help financially, I know that might be a burden for you, send us an email and we'll try to get you connected with them. We know it can be a burden.
I would say we also have an application. We can provide resources here as well. But that's kind of our main pricing system, but we do have an application process for that as well.
Yeah, don't be too ashamed to ask. We'd love to be able to help. How do you help somebody who's self-medicating but don't think that they need help? So how do you tell somebody they need help who thinks they don't need help?
Well, I mean, I'll start, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember in graduate school, one of the counseling classes I was in, the professor had been counseling people for over 40 years, and he said, one thing that I've learned is that you can't help people that don't want help. Like the change process has to be innate. You have to come to a point where you say, I need coaching, I need help, I need healing, I need to change and transform my life. And so I think even on a theological level, it's the same thing, We can try to step in. There's some things that we could do, but ultimately that person has to want the help and the change that is necessary to get to a healthy place in their life.
Yeah,
I love that you said that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I think what Wes is hitting the nail on the head. I think you have a conversation with them initially, and if the response is one of defensiveness, and if they don't want to see where you're coming from, and you have specific examples and they want to outright ignore them, there is not much you can do. They're an adult that is able to make their own decisions. So once I've had a conversation with someone, one time or whatever may have you, you can't make them do what they clearly don't want to do.
Can I speak to families and addiction and kind of?
Yeah, please.
I think this one's also a tricky one. I've seen a couple of different things with families, but I think you do have to. Again, it is that connection, kind of to going back what they said. You have to have the conversation. There will be probably some tough decisions. I would say talk with a counselor, talk with a pastor too, of just like talking through kind of next steps, because it's probably gonna get specific in your relationship with your family and with your kiddo, because it is kind of going back to that question of support and enabling. There's going to be a gray area. There's going to be lines that, okay, this is where you can support. And again, because you're going to want to keep that relationship while also not accepting or going, yes, this behavior is okay. And I think it's okay to say, hey, not in my house, this is not okay around certain areas, and kind of talking through. But I think even asking a pastor, asking a counselor, and talking through some of those kind of questions.
Yeah. This is a very, I think, good question for Lynn to answer. Is it okay for my child to see me cry?
Oh my goodness, yes, please. We do want to model vulnerability. I will say I can think of a parent recently that was struggling with a big loss of her own, and she did share that her concern, she was having therapists that were misunderstanding, that she understood that she could show her children that she was upset, but she also wanted to create enough space from her emotions to really hear about their emotions, because they had also experienced the loss that she was struggling with. And so she came to see me. I often actually see parents before I see children, or different ways of doing that, or the child can go to someone else. But as a parent, it's really important that we're modeling that counseling is something that we can all do and can help many of us. And so I was working with the parent so that she could use, in particular, the brain spotting modality that I practice to work through her own emotions so that she could also show up for her children when they were upset without her emotions taking over the room, if you will. So yes, absolutely, it is okay. It's really a beautiful thing to connect through our tears and our grief. But if you're finding that it feels like a slippery slope, that might be time to see a therapist and get some support around that.
That's good. Anybody have anything to add to that? I definitely hope it's okay to cry in front of your kids, because I do it all the time.
I think just from a cultural point of view, the reason why there's like a lack of emotional intelligence in our culture, not everywhere, but broad brush, is because a lot of us grew up in homes where we didn't talk about our emotions, or we didn't feel the freedom to express various emotions. Like, there's so many emotions that human beings feel. I think one of the best things that we can do, use the term, is we can model. Like, how do we develop emotionally healthy kids and intelligent kids if we don't express or talk about or invite emotions into the relationships in our home? So I just think it's so healthy to deconstruct some of that stuff that maybe, was modeled in our life by saying, I actually want my family to talk on a deeper level, which, oftentimes is just sharing emotions and being vulnerable about how we're feeling and naming what's going on inside of us. So I think if we could do that as Christians and followers of Jesus, here's why. Most importantly, because God is an emotional being. And when God feels something in Scripture, he names it. The Bible clearly expresses that. And so if he's our model and he's the one that ultimately we want to image in our life, then we want to do that in the framework of the closest relationships we have, which is our family of origin, our home, our kids, so on and so forth. And that means guys too. Like, some of these, ideas that have been painted about difference between males and females feeling. No, like, God doesn't teach that. We all feel. Like, there's emotions embedded and wired and designed into all of us by God, because God feels those emotions. And it's not based on male or female, it's just based on him. And so I think just breaking that down and like assimilating that into our life theologically and practically, I think is really healthy.
Yeah, you hit on something that a lot of us can't name what our emotions are or identify them. I can't remember how many emotions there are, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. Yeah. But most people can only identify about 7 in themselves. Wow. Glad, sad, mad, and then some other ones. I don't know. At the end of the day, I've been talking for 4 hours, it feels like. But learning to identify your emotions is a big thing. There's a lady by the name of Brené Brown. She wrote a book called Atlas of the Heart.
Really good.
And it really talks about how to identify your emotions and name certain emotions that you may be feeling.
Another good point that was brought up is looking at your own family of origin and how emotions were used. If they weren't used, or if they were used in a manipulative way, and to be honest with yourself to see, did some of that get in me? There is nothing that has been more humbling and revealing my cracks that maybe I didn't notice than marriage and parenting. Things that I thought that I would never think, do, or say because it happened to me and I would never be that person, and all of a sudden, here I am doing that on some level. And so you want to be intentional and thoughtful about, why am I choosing this moment to be vulnerable in front of my child? What am I expecting from my child in that? Am I crying out of manipulation because I want to get my child to do something? That's a no-no. Am I crying, am I parentifying my child? Am I crying expecting my child to be the one to ease whatever's happening to me? That's a no-no. Or if I'm crying because it is a vulnerable time to create that emotional connection and to role model and, role play what it's like to be authentically vulnerable in front of another person. So really be honest with yourself, which means it's going to be really hard to look at what is some of the motivation behind why you choose certain times to show your emotions in front of people.
Fantastic. Next question. How can I use my faith to help with anxiety about the future?
Wes, you can kill that one.
All right, I'll go first. So the question again, how can I use my faith to help with anxiety about the future. I think one of the things that you'll see throughout the narrative of Scripture is there's hope that God always instills in people throughout different places in Scripture, whether that be in the Old Testament or the New Testament. God is a God of hope. In knowing how things end, that in the end, as a person who puts your faith and trust and belief in Jesus Christ, knowing what the end is, that we're all going to experience this eternal life in a place of pure perfection, I think that helps us with our mental health today to not let us get stuck in what's now and say, man, this is it for me. You know, having hope to know that one day I'm not going to have anxiety. One day depression is not going to have a hold of me. Jesus died, gave his life for me so that I can experience eternal life. What I have on this earth is not what I'm going to have forever. Helps me understand that, man, my future is secure and things may be tough and bad right now, but I have a whole future to deal with. And I think in dealing with anxiety, I know that it's just something that's temporary. It's my lot in this life for right now. It's my thorn in the flesh, but it's not something that I'm going to experience forever.
Yeah, so good. I mean, he taught on it this morning, so listen to his sermon. So good. A couple things. One, I think one of the things we have to do around faith and anxiety or depression or mental health is to normalize it, because this is a part of human suffering. And we don't live in a perfect sphere. It's not like we're in the garden. Like, we're not in Genesis 1 and 2. We're living outside the garden where life has been permeated by brokenness and sin. And I'm not saying that anxiety is sin, but it's a result of living in a broken world. And we feel that in our humanity. And I think our faith should be able to say, not everything here and now is going to be solved. Suffering is not going to be erased because we believe in Jesus. Suffering is a part of following Jesus, because whether you're in Jesus or outside Jesus, whether you believe in him or you don't believe in him, all human beings share the narrative of suffering in our life. So I think acknowledging that is really important, because some people, you know, they're healed, it changes, and other people, they live with long-term chronic conditions because human suffering is a reality. And the second thing is, I think it's so important that we invite God into those challenges and struggles. When God says, do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplication, make your requests be known to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and minds in Christ Jesus. That's not a verse. That verse has been used wrongly, and the essence or the feel of it has been communicated wrongly. That's not God rebuking us for anxiety. That's not God saying, your anxiety is sinful. That's God saying, I'm a loving Father, and I know that life is hard, stresses are hard, concerns are hard. There's things in the future, there's things tomorrow that you might be caring or worrying about. And I just want you to know that I'm here for you and I'm available to give you peace in the midst of all of that. Mm-hmm. So I think we invite a loving, caring God into those struggles in our life, in our mind. And then we also recognize that sometimes we have distortions of thinking, unhealthy patterns of thinking that we can reframe and change over time. Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is invite God into your anxiety. And then Philippians 4, 8, and 9 is change the way you think so that you can be healthy around the concerns and stressors of life. And so I think all of that is a part of our faith. Normalizing it, we suffer, and then inviting God into it, and also changing the way that we think sometimes is really healthy.
Good. I'm going to ask a question very similar to that one I want you to answer, Wes, and then I'll have a couple questions on trauma for the two of you. First is this: how does your relationship with Jesus inform how you approach mental health issues in comparison to how the world approaches mental health issues? James, you can answer this too if you would like.
Me first?
Whoever.
Okay. So when I look at Jesus, I see a human being, God in the flesh, but a human being who dealt with mental and emotional pain. Isaiah chapter 53 says that Jesus was a man of sorrows and well acquainted with grief. The language behind that, those Hebrew terms, refer to mental and emotional pain. Like, he felt the weight of human suffering to the greatest degree of any human in history. We talk about trauma. The trauma that Jesus experienced on the cross was the greatest trauma in human history. So as I look at the narrative of Jesus' life, sometimes in the Western culture, we paint Jesus like happy and everything's great and everything's perfect. No, like he felt the weight of human suffering, and he saw human suffering, and he felt that emotionally as well. That helps me so much. I don't have a Savior that is detached, disconnected experientially from my experience. I have a Savior that is attached on an experiential level that I will never experience with human suffering, mental and emotional pain. That every time I go through something really hard, deeply painful experience as a human being, I know that he understands what that feels like. And I know that he is the safest person to invite into that place in my life. And I just think if you can frame Jesus like that in your life and recognize that when you're going through a hard time, it's not like Jesus hit the eject button, like, oh, God must not love me. No, actually, he's going to be most intimately involved in your life if you invite him into that space. I've gone through some really, really painful experiences in my life. I have found that my intimacy with Christ and my understanding of Jesus experientially has deepened to the greatest degrees when I have invited him into the hardest moments and spaces in my life. And I just encourage you to think of Jesus like that. He's not mad at you. He's not disappointed in you. He's not hitting the eject button because that must be a revelation that I'm not doing well spiritually because I'm suffering. None of that is true. What's true is he loves you and he understands and he wants to be with you in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think going on to the attachment, the connection that you have with the Father, I think a great book on pain and suffering is Timothy Keller's book, Walking Through Pain. I think it's Walking Through Pain and Suffering, Walking with Faith in Pain and Suffering. He has a phenomenal, I think, just look on it and a kind of outlook on pain and suffering and walking with God. And I think it's our connection with God and how we view him. I think there's a lot of clients that in kind of our sphere with Bayside Counseling that they just have a distorted view of God. And I think when you have that distorted view, that's kind of where that disconnect, that detachment, or even just kind of what you were talking a little bit about, you come up with things in your own mind about, oh, well, God wouldn't love me if I blah, 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 or I'm alone in this. And I think our connection with God, especially in mental health, with stress, with anxiety, he has felt that he's been there and he wants to walk with us through it. I think it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, the name of that book is Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering by Tim Keller. Thanks so much for that question. Can a person self-heal from trauma? Is it possible that someone has self-healed and really has it all figured out mentally and emotionally? Or are their emotions just very repressed?
Sure. So I work at a trauma center, and one of the things that I really learned deeply at William Jessup was no one's trauma is greater than someone else's. We all have our own traumas that we're processing through, and we have specific trauma modalities that EMDR, somatic experiencing, and brain spotting are the three that we have research on. Most of the research is in EMDR, and I'm a big believer that when we're processing trauma, that the therapist is really secondary. They're kind of like your co-pilot, and if you're processing your trauma with the right therapist, the attunement piece is particularly important. And beyond that, your own brain and body, I would say in connection with God, because I've never felt God more strongly than I do when I'm brain spotting a client, is going to show you the places you need to go to, the root of the problem, in order to heal. And I think that it's really important to also note that where we are at now in our understanding of mental health is so very different than 20 years ago when I had actually started this journey in getting a master's in counseling. And what we really know now is that we can create new synapses, we can strengthen synapses, our brains are so much, they're profound. They can change in ways that we didn't think before. So going back to Jason's comment on hope, for me, that really gives a lot of hope. And And just because we have trauma does not mean that we can't use that trauma to create the life that we want. And I personally just really think it's concerning when people feel like they are so stuck that they can't see that there might be a different way.
Yeah. So I'll give you a statistic. Over 50% of Americans have had an adverse childhood experience, meaning that they've had some sort of traumatic experience as children. But we don't see over 50% of people in therapy throughout the course of their lives. The human capacity for endurance, the resiliency that people have is remarkable. And I think as a believer, this is where we see the power of the Holy Spirit. For people who are not believers, I don't know what they go to help them understand that. But yes, there are a lot of people who are walking around this world that had unimaginable experiences, and somehow their bodies, their minds have found a way to accommodate to either survive or thrive. And they've acquired tools along the way. Some of those tools are healthy tools. Some of those are not healthy tools. Some people are able to accommodate where they're able to get through almost their entire lives before they hit a wall, or maybe they hit walls in certain areas of their lives, but they're able to either just take the loss or make adjustments along the way. And there's some people that hit a great big wall, and they realize, whoa, I have a lot of healing that I need to do, and there's been some damage along the way. So the answer to that is, yes, people are incredibly resilient, and they figure out oftentimes how to make it through life, sometimes in healthy and unhealthy ways. However, I would say that the healthiest approach to go to is to seek help, to seek understanding, so that you don't find yourself in a position where you look back in your life and you go, my God, the damage that I did because I didn't have the tools, because I didn't realize, I didn't even imagine that I can live a life that's different than the way that I was living it. So I would say, as a cautionary tale, yes, you could probably survive and maybe thrive in some areas, but there could be a lot of damage you can prevent along the way and thrive in ways that you never even imagined if you sought help.
That's good. Another question about what is the role of church members and leaders in coming alongside people who are struggling with mental health issues? I keep hearing about seeking professional help, but would love to hear more about seeking help from your community. Without a doubt, the church community can play a major role in your mental health when you're struggling with mental health, and I believe that we do. One of the ways in which the church can do that is certainly through prayer, but I would also say the hidden gem of any church is small groups. If you're not involved in a small group, if you don't have another collection of believers that you're connecting with regularly to talk to about your problems, then it's going to be hard, I think, to live as a believer in this world alone. Jason Crow and I are in a small group together, and our small group this year has had crisis after crisis after crisis. Family members dying, cancer, sickness, heart issues. It's baffling the number of issues that we've seen within our small group. It's almost like so bad I want to get out, like, man, this thing feels cursed. But I keep showing up and we keep praying for one another because that's what we're called to do. Literally, every text message from the group is just some sort of trauma someone's dealing with or whatever, and we have learned how to pray for one another. On top of that, we have encouraged each other to get help. For example, if somebody has cancer, I wouldn't say, oh, this small group is enough for you. That's all you need. We're going to pray for you. You're going to be okay. No, seek professional help. So we don't have to see it as an either or. You use the church or use professionals. I think being involved and getting both is what we're hitting at. And I think the church has historically done a good job of believers carrying and bearing one another's burdens, but also getting outside help, I think, is essential as well. Anybody else?
I was going to say, if you are looking to get connected here at Blue Oaks, you can come talk to me. I put together a small group, so you can come talk to me, or you can go out to the connection. I just wanted to kind of
Nice little plug there.
Nice.
a little plug. Hey, get in a small group.
Someone asked, this is for Lynn and Stephanie, what is brain spotting? So I'll say briefly, there are different modalities or ways of treating within the mental health community. Brain spotting and EMDR, just a couple of those, but you can talk about what it is.
Go ahead, Lane. Well, okay, brain spotting is a trauma-based tool, and you jump in if I have any holes. And basically what it does is it focuses on the connection between your physiological response and your psychological and emotional response. So basically in brain spotting, there are actual strategies that we use where we are focusing in on the nervous system. We're doing things, you're looking certain places with your eyes, you're paying attention to how your body is responding, and what you're basically doing is really magnifying your nervous system and how your body responds as your brain accesses different memories. So there could be different memories or things that have been buried that you're not aware of, and you need to be able to access those things because you notice that they're causing some issues in your life. So in this modality, you focus on that, and then you process out. You process out with a therapist what you do with those emotions and how you can do what's called resource their emotions, which is access, being calm, being grounded, being neutral, or something else that you want to access, confidence or whatever, to help come alongside you as you're dealing with whatever anxiety or fear or whatever comes up. Now, I do want to recognize there could be people in the room that have a TBI or maybe struggle with memory where you go, I don't think that works for me. There's actually training specifically for people who have a traumatic brain injury or memory issues or things like that. Brain Spotting also has an area specializing in that and working with people who have that.
That was perfect. And also, I think that my favorite piece of the brain spotting modality is that I often see clients that don't want to talk through a trauma again.
Yeah.
Because it's great when we do have connections with other people and we can talk with them, but sometimes we need to be able to sit with how our body feels and what images we're seeing in order to release them. And when we're talking, we're using the front part of our brain, which does not communicate very well with the mid and the hind part of our brains, which is where trauma is primarily stored. And so brain spotting is a really strange name, in my opinion. And the idea really does have to do with that when you're focusing on different spots, you may be able to pull up like a wonderful memory, for example, that actually helps you to clear something that's very traumatic. And so I often will watch clients really marvel at, how did I go to such a wonderful place? Or my favorite is like finding a God spot. Where is your strongest connection to God? And we know that God and Jesus can give such incredible perspective when we're suffering, but when we can really sit with that and have a therapist witness that, and then like Stephanie said, process it through, it's a modality that I've seen people heal things that they really never thought they would heal relatively quickly. And I will be honest, it is a little more expensive some of the time than talk therapy, but it is very focused and results driven. So you're very much meeting with a therapist to identify what the goals are, what do you want it to look like when you're done. And I love that piece, and that's it.
Yep, so that's Brain Spotting 101. I guess just an overview of what it is. How does forgiveness help us with mental health? How does forgiveness help us with mental health?
Well, you could start with, I don't know if it's a cliche, but I've heard it multiple times in the church.
Then it's true.
What's that saying? Like, unforgiveness is drinking poison, expecting the other person to die, kind of deal. So basically,
not in the Bible, but
not in the Bible, but people say it a lot in the church setting.
It's bitterness.
Basically, that unforgiveness begets bitterness and resentment. And those emotions actually produce stress hormones for us that literally chip away at our body, chip away at our hearts, chip away at our ability to be present in joy in areas. And so the importance of forgiveness, number one, if you want to just focus on yourself, is absolutely healthier for you. It helps you enjoy life. It's healthier for your body. It's healthier for your mind. It's healthier for your emotional well-being when you're able to forgive. And forgive is just a way of saying, I am no longer letting this impact me in the same way that it did when it happened. It's not saying I agree with the act. It's not saying that I accept or I receive that person in that act. It's saying that I'm no longer allowing this to impact me in that same way. And that's really, if you look at forgiveness in that way, That's what it does. And then there's some people where you do want to continue a relationship with them. You don't want them to be defined by this particular event that took place. So it's another healthy way of cultivating, repairing, and moving forward in a relationship that you want to continue to have in
Yeah,
your
a
life.
great book on forgiveness is called Forgive, again by Tim Keller. This guy, he recently passed, but man, this dude
The best.
is one of the best. Forgive by Tim Keller. Wes.
Probably the best book. You know what? First of all, Stephanie's answer is so good. The term forgive in the New Testament comes from a Greek term, aphiemi, and it means to release. And a lot of people, the question around forgiveness is why? Why should I release this? Couple thoughts. One, because it's good for us. Like it's good for our soul. And I think you elaborated on that so well. Like when we release it, sometimes we feel paralyzed in all of the narrative that is somehow thwarting us from feeling well and whole in our soul around an event, around a person, around a situation that we just can't get out of our mind or heart. And that can develop, as Hebrews says, the roots of bitterness. They grow and they really affect us inside. So I think we release because it's good for us. Second, I think we release because it's a reflection of God's nature. And as followers of Jesus, we want to become more like Christ. That's the ultimate goal. And everything that we do in Christianity and church, the essence of where we're going is we want to be with Jesus and we want to become more like him. So I think if that's in God's nature, then it's probably good too, to reflect God's nature. And think about like all the things that God's forgiven us. And then I think the third reason to release is it's a mirror into how we want other people to treat us. Like we fail each other. There's a really famous psychologist, doctor of psychology on Instagram, probably the most famous one. And she just came out with, 6 traits of resilient, healthy relationships. And one of them was they forgive over and over and over again. And I think that's true of any healthy relationship. Now, the hard part is when it's a very traumatic event. The offense is to a degree that reshapes our life. I think even in that, because I've experienced these events, we have to come to a point, and it's a process. It's not instantaneous, and sometimes it's a process over a lifetime, where we no longer allow somebody's offense toward us to determine how we live in the health of our soul, in the external choices and habits we develop. And so I think forgiveness is a really important part of that. And something that people misunderstand about forgiveness, and I'll stop in a second, is forgiveness does not mean the residue of pain is no longer there. Forgiveness means we've released it. We're imaging God. We're saying this is healthy for us. We realize that we also offend other people. And we may still have pain, but that doesn't mean we haven't forgiven.
Wes, I do want to say you just broke the record for Greek words used on this stage. Congratulations.
Oh, here at Blue Oaks?
Yes.
I have to say one more thing on this because I do think that it's often misunderstood that what really comes up for me is when someone says, I'm having trouble forgiving. What I think they're often saying is, I really need to process this through. I didn't get to process this through. Or maybe I was a child and my family didn't talk about emotions, and so it's stuck. And now I have back pain, or now I feel depressed. And so I think forgiveness is also a process of allowing a trusted therapist or group to witness your process.
That's good. Are mental health problems a biological problem or a social problem?
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. And they're far more than that.
Yeah.
They're theological, they're biological, they're social, they're cultural, they're personal. There's so much nuance of what's behind mental health. And often it's a collective coalescing of a lot of different things. And so.
Yeah. So we'll talk about this next week. Actually in service, we're talking about depression. But depression can be a biological thing. There's something that's happening in somebody's brain. But it can also happen because of circumstances that have happened in your life. But like clinical depression, is that always biological? Is there always medication that needs to take place? How does that work?
I'm going to jump on this. So I often, before I started practicing, thought I wouldn't want to take a medication to help with this. And I have really reframed that for myself, especially around the idea that God also gave us medication. And sometimes medication is needed, especially in order to boost chemicals like serotonin in your brain enough to where you can process through or to where you can get out of bed. And there's nothing wrong with taking the help, especially to push yourself through to the other side. And so, and there are many people that, in fact, I think, I once heard a woman say, you know, I praise God for the medication that I needed and finding the right fit and finding the right psychiatrist. And so if you're finding yourself in a position where you really can't process through what you need to because the chemicals in your brain are needing that help, you get the help.
Yeah, I was thinking about, you know, when Wes talks about his life work, that he's called to make that connection between mental health and theology, and how they really should have never even been disconnected because they're so interconnected. And I think that's the next thing too, is making the connection between mental health and the physiological and biological aspect. Our minds, yes, when we talk about minds, it just feels so kind of ethereal, like we really we can't see our minds, but there are many physiological processes that are contributing to how we experience life, how we interpret the information that's around us. And because of that, there is very much that connection between that. And so when we look at that, we have to look at mental health as being the same way as if we had some kind of physical ailment. There are some, you look at it on a spectrum, there are some ailments that you can use naturopathic or just allow it to go through your body. And then there can be some ailments where you get to a point where it's like, no, it requires a more intensive intervention. It depends on the person, it depends on the ailment, and that's the same thing to look at mental health, as making that connection as you would with physical ailments as well.
And I'm just going to add in exercise, exercise, exercise. And some people do not want to hear about that, but it is hugely helpful in helping our brains to have the right balance of chemicals. And so sometimes it's challenging to get out there, but there's a book that I often recommend called Healing Anxiety and Depression, and it's written by the Amen Clinic.
Amen is amazing.
And I think Roth is the other author. And not only does it talk about medications, but it also talks at great length about supplements that are very helpful. Mm-hmm. And one of my, there's a great chapter on your thoughts and processing through and what the types of thoughts that you might be having, like black and white thinking, how to challenge that. And my very, very favorite chapter is actually on relationships, because I've often seen people that, they're taking the medication, they're doing the exercise, they're doing all the things and nothing is shifting. What do the relationships look like?
Can I, so I have a kind of a personal example with ADHD. This is something that I kind of talk with parents a lot about, especially with medication, especially with behavior work and also exercise. I think also it's not something you're jumping straight to, kind of like, because I think some people do jump straight to it, and I think that's okay, because something that my parents did, it's not okay just to jump straight to it, but it's okay to have the conversation. I think my parents handled that conversation, because we even had this as a family. I was diagnosed at first grade, just kind of that stereotypical, just diagnosed and, hey, let's get a medication. But my parents had the conversation with me in first grade. We went on it, we went off of it, we went back on. And I think for me, just growing up as someone who had ADHD and kind of was struggling in school, struggling with even social aspects, I think having that conversation and bringing them in was really important. It was really impactful, I think, for me. Because there was some things that it was really helpful with school. And so then there was even some behavior work that a mentor of mine worked with me, as I was like struggling in school, that self-confidence, because you could just feel like, okay, I just blurted out something and then you lose your friends, and it kind of feels, it can feel very, very self-defeating. And so I think the conversation around medication, bringing them in at an appropriate level, but being able to have that conversation, I think is so, so key. But yes, having the exercise, I think one of the first things I do is go, hey, what's the exercise? What's their diet like? What is the social aspects, and if there's anything in the past, because trauma can sometimes, I know, can have some symptoms of behavior of ODD or ADHD sometimes.
Thanks for sharing that.
I think it's, there's medication. There's also, everyone may not need medication, but everyone should ask themselves, how am I taking care of my body? Am I taking good care of my body? And I am going through training in this, and I do talk to my clients about supplements and the ways that they can change their diet. There's certain foods that are contributing to not nourishing your body well. Maybe you're deficient in certain areas that are actually contributing to anxiety, anxious feelings, or depressive moods in that. So across the board, everybody should ask themselves, if they're feeling like something is happening, is how am I taking care of my body? And what am I doing to my body? How am I neglecting my body in ways that really needs my attention?
Very good. We got time for a couple of more questions, probably 2 or 3 more. I'll start with this one. How do you recognize that someone needs help and nudge them towards getting help?
I would say with teens, something I talk with parents about is kind of the persistent behavior. So I think it goes back to even knowing your child, going back to, okay, do you know what their normal behaviors are? Because I think, we'll look at stuff like, okay, they overeating, kind of those more extremes. And so then we'll kind of look at that. Maybe there's an event that happened, and so then we can kind of place a piece. But I think, too, just having the conversation, and I think it kind of is going back to that support question, but really getting to know, hey, these are some concerns that I have, kind of being able to talk with them. Because I think sometimes, parents want to help their kids. I think that's ultimately, they want to help, and I think that's great. And I don't, sometimes they'll go, maybe something just seems off to them, like you're an extroverted parent, and your kid's introverted, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, do they need help? Are they depressed? Are they sad? And I do have some of that conversation. And I think that's okay to kind of go, hey, they're a little introverted, and that's okay, or maybe they're more extroverted, you're more introverted. They're going out, they're doing all these things. You're like, my kid is like out of control, and I don't know what's happening. It's like, well, that just may be their personality. Now there may be some nuances. Again, talking to a professional, we'll have to go through it. But I think kind of going, okay, are they ready for therapy? I think going, okay, what is their baseline? What is their normal? Do I know them? And then going, okay, what are the excesses? I think I'll look at that for sure, and I think some of us will look at that and kind of go, yeah, when you bring them in, we'll ask some questions or do some tests and go from there.
And please, please, please let them be part of the process of choosing the therapist if they are going to go to therapy.
Yes. Amen.
Let me bring this up. I think this is important for parents to know. What about confidentiality in your teenager going to see a therapist? How does that work? Is the therapist going to tell everything that your kid tells you? How does that work?
So yeah, I mean there are some things by like legal reasons what we have to disclose, but I'll just kind of speak to like a normal, the things outside of the reportable abuse or kind of self-harm or anything like that. But one thing that I'll generally talk to parents about is, look, everything we talk about is confidential, so they can share. And I'll talk with the kid and just go, here's the thing. If your parents can ask me any questions, but I'm not going to answer every question. But if they do, I'll generally bring in the kiddo and be like, hey, here, can I answer them like this? They have this question. Can we talk about this? Or one thing I'll generally try to do, because ultimately I want the family to have the conversation, right? It's not just me being the middleman between the whole family. But I'll go, hey, would you be okay with talking with your family about this? And if so, maybe we'll bring them in and have that conversation so they feel like, hey, I can be there, play a little referee or anything like that. And I've done that a few times, but one thing was confidentiality. I definitely want it to be confidential, but I don't want the parent to feel like they're excluded from the process, right? Because when you do that, then you're not helping the kid, because eventually they might, they'll stop, and that family needs to be a family unit, and I think that's what you need to build. And so I do teeter. It's a tricky line to go across, but those are kind of the few things that I'll do. Is I'll just go, look, your parent wants to know about this. What are you okay with me saying? And then I'll even sometimes either give a general overview of like, hey, here's what we've been focused on. Here's what we've been going. But I try to invite the parent in the process. I think if I don't, then honestly, I've been a failure as a therapist personally.
That's so good, James. That's so
Thanks.
good. Just wanted to tell you that was so good. Anybody else want to respond to that? I'm getting the last 2 questions.
We'll wait for the next question.
Dan in the back, sorry.
Okay, I'll talk because I'm gonna save Jason. He's waiting for the last.
I have the last 2 questions.
Oh, you're ready? Okay.
I'd like to ask him. Yes.
Can I just say before this,
Oh.
I am so grateful for our church. like that allows us to do this, to have these conversations, that really cares about what people are walking through. Like, we're so blessed to be a part of Bayside and Bayside Blue Oaks. Like,
Yes, I agree.
so grateful.
Yeah. All right, last two questions. Is there such a thing as a spirit of anxiety or a spirit of depression? If so, is this something that can only be handled on a spiritual level?
I want to jump on this for a second, and I'm going to talk a little bit about externalization, actually. And so when we look at our problems and our challenges as something that has a shape, that has a color, that has an intention, it's much easier to manage it than thinking it's something that we need to, because part of what I hear in that question is, should I be scared of this? Should I be worried enough about this that I'm going to have to give my soul over to it or something of that nature? And so I also think that it's very helpful to think of ourselves and our children in parts. There might be part of me that feels really overtaken with this, like I'm scared on a spiritual level, and I'm scared that there's evil here, for example. And what I want to say is that we all have many different parts of ourselves, some parts that we maybe don't really enjoy interacting with as much as other parts. And I really see a lot of healing in looking at all of the different parts of ourselves and how they can start to collaborate. Because just like there is good in the world, yes, there is also evil, and there is also balance. And so that's the way I would respond to.
I'm so glad Lynn brought up externalization. That is so important, because it's not identifying, not creating the problem or that emotional state as being who you are, but as being a state that shows up in your life from whatever reason. And so we are biopsychosocial spiritual beings, right? So all of those things are existing inside of us. And so maybe at this point, to her point, is anxiety is showing up in your life, and it seems like, and you are sensitive to the fact that it's impacting the spiritual part of you. Maybe you're like, physically, I'm doing all the things. I'm taking the supplements, I'm exercising, all this stuff, but the spiritual aspect of me, that needs attention. These are all gears, the biological, the psychological, the spiritual, the social. Look at them as all gears working inside of us. And when one gear starts going off kilter, eventually what happens? The other ones start getting impacted on some level. And maybe it's a sensitivity and awareness to, wow, I can feel specifically that this gear is getting particularly pummeled by this state that's existing. And so think of it in that way.
Good. Greek, sir, would you like to add anything? All right, does forgiveness mean, this is such an important question, I think, for everybody to hear. Does forgiveness mean we should have relationship with the abusive person that we have now forgiven?
No, and I think a lot of that comes down to boundaries, and that when we can protect ourselves and make choices for ourselves that maybe we couldn't make before, that's empowering. And another thing that I've often had clients feel better about than maybe traditional notions of forgiveness is the idea that God's love is all around us. I might not be capable at this moment of sending my own love and forgiveness, but I also know that God is capable of many things that I might not even be able to. So I like the idea of releasing to God.
That's so good. All right, one more. How do you get through a divorce with children when you suffer from severe depression disorder? First of all, I'll tackle just the first part of this, is that is an extremely difficult thing to deal with. When you're dealing with any mental health struggle, when you have children and you're trying to raise them and live in the world and do things to support your family, it is extremely difficult. I think to answer your question, I would say with a lot of help and support. Help from your church family and for the people who you're connected with, I think that's important. Hopefully help from family, but also help from professionals as well would be the answer that I would give for that. Anybody want to add to that?
I just want to add one other piece of, and Stephanie and I were actually talking about this before we came on stage, the idea that sometimes when it feels like everything is falling apart, God's synchronicity is all around us. And sometimes it's just in recognizing the small things. Like, there were still Cheerios for this morning. So I'm glad there were still Cheerios in the bowl. And a lot of people feel this is not a way to not validate how difficult life is when it's very difficult. Sometimes we just really need someone to sit in the hole with us, because I think depression oftentimes feels like a pit, and it feels endless and really dark. And so you do need to find a therapist that can sit in the hole. You don't want somebody that's just going to be like, look at all the positive things. And also, as someone that's just recently gone through a challenging divorce myself, I will say that focusing on the small things where I could really still hear God whisper was what got me through, because God is quiet, God is not loud, especially in those situations.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I really appreciate you showing up. Can we give it up for our panel, everybody who participated? I do want us to close out in prayer, and if you have questions, you can continue to send them to Ask Us at 56316. We'll try to figure out some mechanism to answer those questions in some form to put them out on. Probably won't get to them all, but we'll look for ways to be able to do that. But I'm gonna ask Wes, if you don't mind.
Do you want to say something out there?
Oh, yes. Out in the lobby, we actually have 3 different booths, one for Celebrate Recovery, one for our care ministry, and the third one for the counseling center. So right after this, if you want to get connected, if you want to find out about some additional resources, there'll be some people for you to talk to out in the lobby as well. I also want to say this. I probably shouldn't say this, but it's almost 3 o'clock, so here we go. For our people who are part of the panel, oftentimes when we do these panels, people have questions afterwards. We don't mind you asking those questions, but we do want to ask that you not monopolize their time. In other words, if you can just get their email and share your question privately, that might be helpful. But if you monopolize their time, then there are other people who won't be able to be seen as well. Did I say that nicely enough?
You said it.
Okay, thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. See, thank you. All right, Wes,
Yes.
pray for us.
Okay, absolutely. Lord, I just thank you so much for this conversation. And I know in a room like this, there's probably many that have intimate interactions with mental health struggles in this moment, whether that's personally, whether that's a family member. And Lord, I just pray for your kindness and presence to be felt in every person's life that is struggling. I pray that we would have a right understanding that struggling with our mental health is not a litmus test for spirituality, but it's just a reality of living in a broken, fallen world often. And I pray for hope and healing and help and support and love and grace and kindness for every person who is struggling. And Lord, I just also ask for those who are connected to somebody struggling that they would offer the same things that they would desire, and that there would just be a sense of love, support, grace, and kindness in their interactions as well. Lord, through this series, I just pray that more and more we would see you rightfully, that we would have a healthy picture of Jesus interacting with pain, and that would change the way that we interact with ourselves around pain, and also the way that we would interact with other people. May we be a church that is known to be the safest place for people who need hope and who are suffering. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Much love.
Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.